Welcome to a deep dive. You've brought us some really interesting source material today, centered around a pretty provocative idea, what the sources are calling the war on youth.
That's right. The material makes a strong case, looking particularly at the U.S., but with trends you can see elsewhere, too, that society structures are, well, treating young people quite badly.
Badly how?
In ways that are having significant economic, social, and even psychological impacts.
Okay, let's unpack this. So our mission for this deep dive is really to dig into your sources, pull out the main arguments about how this war on youth is playing out, why the material thinks it's happening, and what solutions or perspectives are offered.
Exactly.
We want to get to the heart of it, understand the key points quickly and thoroughly for you listening.
Yeah, we'll look at the specific economic data they cite, the critique of institutions like higher education, and even how it connects to things happening right now, like the campus protests.
Right.
The goal is really to see how these sources link these, seemingly separate issues into one big argument about intergenerational conflict and sort of a disinvestment in young people.
Got it. So the economic angle.
Yeah.
The sources kick right off with a heavy point. For the first time, supposedly, in U.S. history, a 30-year-old isn't doing as well economically as their parents were at 30.
That's presented as this fundamental breaking of the social compact. The whole idea that if you work hard, play by the rules, your kids should do as well, or ideally better than you.
Right. The American dream, basically.
And when that promise breaks down, the material argues it creates this massive dissatisfaction, rage, even shame.
And the numbers cited are pretty stark, aren't they? Something about 70-year-olds versus people under 40.
Yeah, the average 70-year-old being 72% wealthier than 40 years ago, while the average person under 40 is actually 24% less wealthy over that same time frame.
Wow. And the source argues this isn't just happening, it's intentional.
That's the contention. That almost every major economic policy in the U.S., when you look closely, functions as a kind of thinly veiled transfer of wealth from young to old, from entrants, as they call them, to incumbents.
Can you give us some examples from the sources? What policies are they pointing to?
Sure. Well, they point to the two biggest tax deductions, capital gains and the mortgage interest deduction.
Okay.
The argument is these overwhelmingly benefit older generations who are more likely to own stocks, own homes, not younger people earning salaries or, paying rent.
Right. Makes sense. And Social Security gets brought up too.
Yes, and framed really provocatively as senior security.
Yeah.
The point made isn't necessarily that the program itself is bad, but that in its current form, it acts as this huge, $1.4 trillion a year transfer of wealth.
From young workers to retirees.
Exactly. And the critique is that it's based purely on age, not on actual financial needs. So it benefits the wealthiest generation in history. The source calls that aspect outrageous. And building on that whole idea of economic transfer, the source highlights the COVID-19 stimulus, calls it potentially the ultimate intergenerational wealth transfer.
Right. This was trillions injected into the economy. What's the source's take on where that money went?
Well, the claim is that, $5 to $7 trillion flooded the market. But crucially, maybe 60 to 80% of it wasn't actually spent on necessities. It was saved.
Saved. And then what?
The argument is that money then flowed into the markets. Assets.
And the impact was?
Huge. On asset prices. The source points to U.S. real estate average price jumped from around $290,000 to $410,000.
Wow.
And then you couple that with rising interest rates. The average mortgage payment, they say, basically doubled, from maybe $1,100 to $2,200 a month.
So buying a home just got way harder for young people?
Exactly. The source claims affordability plummeted, went from maybe 2/3 of Americans potentially being able to afford a home down to just 1/3.
Ouch.
Yeah. As the source puts it, pretty bluntly, if you owned a home already, it felt like champagne and cocaine. If you didn't, you were essentially screwed.
And the stock market followed a similar path.
It screamed upwards, is the phrase used. So again, if you own stocks, you benefited massively.
So the core argument is the younger entrants got squeezed, the older incumbents got richer, and the debt for all this stimulus now lands
on the younger generations. That's the source's bottom line there.
Okay, so beyond economics, the sources also point a finger at higher education, saying it's part of the problem.
Yes, definitely. The material argues that the incumbents within higher ed have achieved what it calls regulatory capture. Basically, they run the show for their own benefit, meaning a model of increasing their own compensation while actually decreasing accountability.
How does that manifest, according to the source?
Through what they call an LVMH strategy. Think luxury goods artificially constraining supply.
Oh.
The example given is Harvard. Its endowment is up like 4,000% in 40 years. Massive growth. But the number of freshman seats, up only 4%.
Tiny increase.
Right. The source argues they could admit vastly more students, qualified students, without hurting quality, but they choose not to. Like a luxury brand creating scarcity. Why? Part of the argument is it makes the people who do get in feel super special.
And the effect of that scarcity then is?
Well, it drives up the value of degrees for those who already have them, the incumbents. And it means talented kids who don't get into those few elite spots get arbitraged down, is the term used.
Arbitrage down.
Yeah, they end up at second or third tier schools, but because all tuition has risen so much, they're still paying, quote, Mercedes prices for a Hyundai product. The source calls it corrupt cartel pricing.
The source also shares a personal story here, right? To make a point about what college used to be.
Right. The speaker mentions getting into UCLA themselves with a pretty low GPA back when acceptance rates were much higher, then Berkeley for grad school.
And the point is?
The point is that higher ed's purpose was or should be to give, quote, unremarkable people a chance of being remarkable. Upward mobility. Not just identifying a pre-existing superclass of rich, already remarkable kids.
The argument being we've lost the script on that.
Completely lost the script, yeah. And this, interestingly, connects to their point about DEI controversies.
Oh, so. They call the anger over DEI a misdirect.
Precisely. The source contends the real anger isn't actually about who gets into Harvard or Yale. It's about how few get in overall.
Oh. Okay.
They point out, community colleges accept almost everyone. You don't see the same DEI firestorms there. The core issue, they argue, is this hoarding of opportunity, whether it's elite college spots or housing, where existing homeowners block new construction.
Right. Limiting supply again.
Exactly. It all benefits the incumbents, the people already inside the system, at the expense of the young entrants trying to get in. DEI just becomes the flashpoint for that deeper frustration about limited capacity. And the ultimate outcome of all this economic pressure, this lack of opportunity, according to the sources, is the toll it takes on young people's well-being.
What does the material say about that? The human cost.
It's pretty grim. It states that youth in America today are statistically more obese, more anxious, more depressed, and angrier than any previous generation.
Wow.
And tragically have the highest rates of suicide and self-harm.
That really puts the economic discussion into a stark human context.
It does. The source basically asks, what is the point of any of this? GDP, growth, all that.
Oh.
If our kids aren't doing well, it hammers home that point. We've literally lost the script.
And politically. What's the connection made there?
Well, the material suggests that seniors who vote reliably tend to elect representatives who, in turn, continue to vote themselves or their age cohort more money. It points out the U.S. spends the least per capita on children among Western nations. And there's this notable disconnect, right? The average age of elected leaders is around 62, but the average age of Americans is 38.
Big gap.
Huge gap. So the source raises the question. Can older leaders, whose formative experiences were decades ago, truly understand the unique challenges young people face today? Things like the impact of TikTok, or the struggle to find affordable housing, or just limited pathways into the middle class. Can an 81-year-old really grasp the world of a 25-year-old single mom?
A fair question. So, if that's the diagnosis from the sources, what about the cure? What do they suggest can actually be done?
Well, the most basic advice offered is just vote. Though they immediately follow that up by noting the perception that, money talks lighter than votes in Washington, D.C.
A bit cynical, maybe?
Perhaps realistic from their perspective.
Yeah.
They argue there's a need for forward-leaning investments, things that benefit everyone long-term, which they say past generations did, but the current one isn't. They ask if this is intergenerational selfishness.
Okay. Are there more specific political or policy changes they push for?
Yes, they advocate for things like ranked choice voting, final five voting. The idea being these could lead to more moderate, more representative leaders and break the cycle of high re-election rates for unpopular institutions. And they explicitly call for electing younger leaders, people whose age is closer to the average American.
And what about the student loan issue? The sources criticize the idea of a big bailout.
They do. They see a large-scale bailout, like the $750 billion one mentioned, as a flawed policy.
Why flawed?
Because the argument goes, it only benefits the roughly one-third of people who went to college, but it's paid for, essentially, by the two-thirds who didn't.
Okay.
They call it shrinking the tumor, providing some relief, but not curing the underlying cancer.
Which is?
The rapidly rising cost of education itself. They point out education costs have outpaced inflation more than almost anything else except maybe healthcare.
So what are the proposed solutions for fixing higher education then?
The sources suggest taking a big chunk of money, say $500 billion maybe from that proposed bailout fund, and investing it directly into about 500 major public universities, roughly $1 billion each, adjusted for size.
Okay, invest it how? For what purpose?
For three main things. One, increase freshman class size by 6% every year. The argument is these public universities are great, they have capacity, and this would fight that arbitraging down problem, get more kids into good schools.
Right. More slots. What's number two?
Cut costs by 2% per year using technology and scale. The goal, double the number of seats and halve the cost per student within a decade. Make college affordable like it supposedly was in the 80s and 90s. The source says this isn't radical.
Ambitious goal. And the third point?
Make 20% of all certifications and degrees vocational. We're talking 1 to 2 year programs in skilled trades, specialty nursing, complex instruction, plumbing, specific installations like soapstone.
Ah, so not just 4-year degrees.
Exactly. The source argues, look, not everyone fits the 4-year model. These trades are desperate for workers, and they pay really well, like $90K to $130K within a couple of years.
Good income.
Very good. They contrast the U.S. apprenticeship rate, like 3%, with much higher rates in the UK or Germany. Public universities, they argue, should be training plumbers and welders too, especially with projected shortages. Stop pushing everyone towards elite degrees and framing trades as failure.
And what about the existing student debt? Any solution proposed there?
Yes, a strong argument that student loan debt should be dischargeable in bankruptcy. They point out it's treated almost uniquely in the U.S. You can't easily get rid of it.
Unlike other debts.
Right. And the source sees it as this crushing burden placed on young people, often for an education system they critique as overpriced. It haunts you the rest of your life, they say. It's presented as a tragedy.
The sources also circle back to DEI in their solutions, offering another critique and an alternative beyond just the misdirect idea.
They do. They acknowledge DEI started from a good place, addressing real historical underrepresentation, citing how few black students were at Ivies in 1960 versus the majority non-white classes now, which they see as progress.
No.
But, they argue, its current form often ends up benefiting well-off minority candidates, and it's become this expensive, kind of unaccountable bureaucracy. Challenge it, and you risk being called racist.
Okay.
And the source contends that by explicitly trying to advantage certain groups, totaling 76% of the population based on visible traits, it inevitably discriminates against the remaining 24%, namely white males in college admissions.
So what's the alternative they propose?
Affirmative action based purely on need and adversity. Socioeconomics. The color should be green, is the phrase used.
Based on need, not race.
Exactly. They mention the University of California's adversity score model as one example. The speaker also references their own background, low-income, single-parent, benefiting from Pell Grants as need-based aid working. The focus should be on getting more disadvantaged people in, based on their actual circumstances, not managing group percentages. They also dismiss university departments focused on things like leadership, ethics, sustainability, DEI as, quote, expensive social engineering projects funded by student debt, arguing the focus should be skills for economic value.
Okay, so the source material ties all this together, the economic pressure, the institutional barriers, the resulting anger, and connects it to what we're seeing now, like the campus protests over Gaza and divestment.
Right. The argument is that this general underlying rage acts as an incendiary fuel or an opportunistic infection. It doesn't necessarily cause the specific protests, but it makes everything hotter, more volatile.
Like pouring gasoline on a fire.
Sort of, yeah. Like a fight in a relationship that isn't just about who left the cap off the toothpaste, but about everything else simmering beneath.
But the force doesn't just leave it at general anger, right? It offers specific analysis of the protests themselves.
Correct. While making that link, it also critiques aspects of the movement. It notes what it perceives as a lack of mature, effective spokespeople compared to past movements, citing some social media examples. It also suggests the scale of the protests is often overblown in the media, claiming, only a small percentage of students are usually involved at the peak, and citing sources saying 40–60% of protesters at some key events weren't even students.
Interesting. And why Gaza specifically? Why has that become such a flashpoint on campuses, according to the sources? They offer reasons.
They offer three main factors. First, the academic framework often taught of oppressed versus oppressor.
Okay.
The source argues this leads young people to, perhaps wrongly, conflate the U.S. civil rights movement with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And within that framework, the easiest way to identify the oppressor is often by wealth and whiteness.
Right.
Which leads, the source contends, fairly or unfairly, to Jews in Israel being seen as ground zero for the ultimate rich white oppressor group.
Okay, that's the first factor. What's the second?
In historical comparison they make, they look at the U.S. response after Pearl Harbor, 2,200 U.S. deaths, leading to maybe 3.5 million Japanese casualties, or 9/11, 2,800 U.S. deaths, leading to maybe 400,000 casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan. They contrast the scale of those responses with the level of global outrage directed at Israel's response in Gaza, arguing the numbers and reactions don't fit historical patterns after an attack. The provocative conclusion the source draws is Jews aren't allowed to win a war.
Strong claim.
Very. Though they do add a caveat that Israel, in their view, hasn't exactly draped itself in glory, criticizing Netanyahu and the handling of Gaza, suggesting Israel has shifted perception from David to Goliath. And the third factor cited involves external influence. This is where TikTok comes in.
Right. What's the argument about TikTok's role?
The sources argue TikTok, being controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, functions as a propaganda tool, that the CCP deliberately puts a thumb on the scale to divide America.
Why would they do that?
The theory presented is the CCP sees the U.S. as a rival, can't beat it militarily or economically right now, so the strategy is destabilization, make Americans hate each other through psychological operations or psyops. And the evidence they offer for this is data allegedly showing a huge imbalance on TikTok. Something like 52 pro-Hamas videos served for every one pro-Israel video.
52 to 1.
That's the figure cited. And they contrast this with polling they mentioned that suggests most young Americans under 25 actually support Israel. They argue this ratio is wildly different for other topics sensitive to the CCP, like the Uyghur situation or Free Tibet, where content is allegedly suppressed on TikTok compared to other platforms. It aligns, they claim, with what the CCP would want.
Wow. Okay, that was definitely a deep dive. We covered a ton of ground there. Economics, higher ed, the psychological impact, potential fixes, and then connecting it all to current events, even global tech influence. The source material really weaves together a powerful narrative, arguing young people face these unique systemic headwinds and contending it's partly due to deliberate choices favoring older generations, the incumbents.
We looked at the data they use on wealth transfer, the critique of college cost and access, the really worrying picture painted about youth mental health, and then the proposed solutions: political reform, rethinking education, vocational training, and finally exploring that complex argument linking the underlying anger to protests and potentially external digital forces.
It's clear the sources want you, the listener, to see these problems not as isolated incidents, but as interconnected parts of a bigger system. A system they argue urgently needs reevaluation because ignoring the well-being and prospects of the young, well, it comes at a huge cost for everyone.
Yeah, the material really challenges you to think about the long-term consequences of where things are heading.
So, as you reflect on all this information we've unpacked, here's a final thought to mull over, drawn from our sources. What exactly is our collective obligation to pay it forward? And what happens if society continues down a path that seems to prioritize the present comfort of some vice over the future well-being and opportunities of the next generation?
A critical question the source material leaves us with.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into your sources. We hope this has given you a clearer, more organized understanding of the key arguments presented in this material concerning the war on youth.